Well, it's great to be back in Illinois. It's been a long time. I was on this campus a number of years ago, but I didn't set foot in Springfield between the time I left in 1994 and yesterday. So it's a real treat to be back here. I also want to thank Mike, Gary, Dave for creating an institution that allowed me to do some very interesting work, participate with some really great fellow scholars and researchers, and to really open up some areas of research that were not being pursued at other institutions that were looking at hazardous waste issues. It was an extraordinary opportunity that lasted until about 1992, when during an earlier spasm of budget cuts, my position was eliminated. I don't say this out of resentment, because it did open up new doors for me, and I was able to go do other interesting things. And it was a far better situation than experienced by some of my colleagues at the State Museum, which has seen the doors locked. And I guess the lottery winners no longer being given IOUs these days. So those days were not very dark compared to what we've seen now. But I want to talk a little bit about this historical research agenda that has taken a hazardous, that was started back in 1984. And now we've transitioned from the Hazardous Waste Center to the ISTC. That one doesn't roll off my tongue just yet, but I'll keep trying. If we look at the historical context, as has been mentioned earlier today, when this center was formed, there were some interesting things going on. And you have to think about what had happened in other parts of the country. Love Canal was one of many places around the country where there had been really unregulated, undocumented disposal of hazardous materials and other industrial waste. This shows a picture of the site in 1942 when Hooker Chemical really began disposing of some 20,000 tons of hazardous waste in an excavation, more or less a clay-lined excavation. It was not lined intentionally, it was just a naturally occurring clay deposit. That area was covered and closed in the early 1950s, and the land sold to the local school board for $1, with the provision in the deed that there was industrial residue. That was the term used. Every few years, Hooker would be called out to kind of put new dirt on as waste would kind of rise to the surface. People scavenged dirt to use as fill across the neighborhood. But in the late 1970s, there was a period of time, a number of years, when there was heavy snowfall and water would seep into the Love Canal itself, and basically the waste just bathtubed over. And this caused a great deal of concern. After decades, actually, of waste seeping into people's basements as well, clogging up their sump pumps. Amazing story of this site. But this site became then the poster child for hazardous waste sites around the country, and really prompted the government to go beyond RCRA and the tracking of existing waste from the cradle to the grave. And when I saw my ad for my job in Science Magazine, Illinois was interested in finding out if they had their own Love Canal, basically. This is kind of what I was told when I came up here. This is the southeast side of Chicago, the Lake Calumet area. Looking at this in the larger context of government regulation, government management of hazardous waste, which is really an essential foundation for doing this kind of discussion, we see that RCRA was passed in 1976, tracking waste, the manifest system, tracking waste from the cradle to the grave, but really looked at current activity. Love Canal and other sites like the Valley of the Drums and Times Beach and whatnot prompted a complete reassessment of hazardous waste management, and a recognition that we needed to address not just the current ongoing waste activity, but needed to address the abandoned sites, the derelict sites around the country. And Circular was passed, which created a system of identifying not just the current actors, but the past actors. It imposed government liability, strict liability on former owners and operators of hazardous waste sites, which really opened up the door for, and really demanded, a long-term perspective on hazardous waste-related sites. And that was the opening that we tried to address when I began working for the Hazardous Waste Research and Information Center. And it was the discovery of the Love Canals that really underscored William Faulkner's statement that the past is not dead, it's not even past. Those hazardous waste lived in those dumps and waste sites for many, many years beyond the date of the activity that created those waste sites. So when I arrived here, they asked me to come do the first of several case studies. We looked at Lake Calumet, we worked at Winnebago County or Rockford, the East St. Louis area, Madison and St. Clair counties. And then as the national concerns changed and the whole discussion about hazardous waste changed, we began looking beyond just these series of case studies. And I developed a general geographic model, historical geographic model of waste disposal in urban areas. And then we also developed a series of tools and applications that more or less parallel some of the other work that was going on. The case studies were to be seen as baseline information for other studies that the Hazardous Waste Center was working on. And the first of these came out in 1985. It was a study of the Lake Calumet area, and really looked at about a century of industrial activity. And one of the real challenges was, how do you create a report on hazardous waste when there's no inventory of hazardous waste? My first job was to first do a history of what industry was there, then look at the technology that those industries followed, what raw materials they used, what were their waste products, then look at their industrial waste management practices, look at the regulatory framework that existed at the time and that changing regulatory framework over time, and then create a long-term longitudinal study of industrial waste. In the Calumet area, we found that this was an area that was industrialized in the late 19th century. It was a railroad corridor district, iron and steel manufacturing, paint manufacturing, railroad, car manufacturing, some chemical processing and manufacturing. We even received a call to go up there and look at, there was a small lead smelter that made the little lead toys they used to put in Cracker Jacks. It just drop these little lead figurines in the Cracker Jacks, unwrapped. But it was a different era. But they would then dump their waste in these clay pits, where clay was mined to make bricks. After the Chicago fire in the 1870s, building codes required all structures to be made of bricks, fireproof to burn. Well, they found these excavations handy for dumping lead dross, basically. But by the time we got there, they were actually selling it. It was being exported to Europe. I don't understand the economics there, but they found a market there. But this was an amazing, complex industrial area where much of the land was actually made using industrial waste. This whole area at the mouth of the Calumet River, and the land on that last picture was made with slag from iron and steel manufacturing. We found an array of sources, everything from business directories, industrial histories. We looked at the occupational health literature to see what kind of toxic substances workers were being exposed to begin to document what was going on. We looked at court records. There were some amazing records. The first suit by the Corps of Engineers against a manufacturer for under the 1899 Water Pollution, not Pollution Act, but the Rivers and Harbors Act, was in the Lake Calumet area, or the Calumet River area. They were suing several steel companies for dumping waste in the Calumet River, and then they had to dredge it, and the Corps of Engineers dredged it and then took it out and dumped it out in Lake Michigan. But these court records had amazing detail about industrial waste management activities well before EPA was formed, well before RCRA was passed. We used aerial photographs, we used historical maps, and here you can see the basic changing shape of Lake Calumet as the northern end was used as a municipal landfill. All in all, this enables us to create a series of maps showing the relationship of the spatial relationship of where waste were discarded, during what periods of time, and then we can relate that to the industrial practices and the waste management practices at the time. I was up in Chicago last spring, had lunch on the veranda of the new golf course that's up there. This is the north end of Lake Calumet. Much of the landfill is now, I think it's got two golf courses up there. It's really a remarkable change since the first time I was up there in 1984. After the Lake Calumet study, we went and began working on a project in Rockford, which is very different than Chicago. It was a smaller area, but it was a city with an intense metal plating industrial base. We toured one of the metal plating, Gary and I toured one of the metal plating plants, and they were just gearing up to supply all the bolts for the brand new Taurus, the Ford Taurus. And they were doing a 100% inspection on every bolt. Normally 2%, somewhere in that, really well under 10%. They would actually manually pick up and look and inspect, did they get a good plating job on those bolts? Ford didn't want any mishaps with this new model they were launching. But the point is that these companies were producing a variety of toxic waste. This was a community that relied heavily on shallow sand and gravel aquifers for its water supply. And we were able to find a really amazing inventory done in 1927 by the Sanitary District of Rockford that inventoried all the industrial waste by manufacturers at the time and how they were handling their waste. A lot of it was going into the river or being dumped on site. Over the course of this study, we were able to also map out industrial activity, industrial waste disposal activity in relationship to the aquifers and the water wells in the area. Our next study took us down to the East St. Louis area, Madison and St. Clair counties. And there was an emerging concern with derelict industrial properties at this time, not old abandoned waste sites, but old industrial sites that had outlived their function and had been obliterated. A term was developed called TOAs, totally obsolete, abandoned, derelict structures. We were looking at those not just with derelict, but those that had actually been bulldozed over. Because under Superfund, if you acquired one of those properties, you became an owner, not necessarily an operator, but you became an owner and acquired some potential liability. So there was an emerging concern about these sites that had disappeared, maybe had been forgotten. And one example here is the old lead smelter in Collinsville. This was a site where they brought lead over from Missouri, used Illinois coal, and created lead. The picture on the left shows the facility in the 1920s. On the right, you see it again in the 1970s. The facility was gone. It was dismantled at the outset of the Great Depression. The owners thought maybe if they took it to the southern hemisphere, the economic cycles would be going in the opposite direction, kind of like the water that goes down your sink. And they thought the economy would be good in the southern hemisphere. I don't know how things panned out, but they left a site that was later developed as a residential subdivision. And on the lower right picture, that's a mound of lead slag left behind by the manufacturer. EPA did some analysis of the water in the pond, and it was considered to be above tolerable levels for human exposure, but kids were swimming in the lake in the summertime. We were able to link up a history of this industrial activity and show much greater detail than was really known at the time. Another site was the Kettle River creosote works. Across the south, we have tons of creosote sites that are on the Superfund list. This is one of our favorite types of Superfund sites. This is one that was not on the Superfund list when we were there, but here was a site that was active up until the 1950s, and creosote works used cadmium, chromium, those kind of things in the creosote mixture to knock out the bacteria that cause wood decay. And this was it was completely obliterated by the 1970s, and by the 1980s, when we were up there working, had been converted to a small business district. Not a school, fortunately, but the owners of the properties there were completely unaware that they were on a site that had been used for a hazardous material-related activity. And this is the Kettle River Business Cluster. It was mentioned earlier the Cuyahoga River fire inspired passage of the Clean Water Act. Well, Illinois had earlier open water fires. Down at Grassy Lake in Roxana, just south of what's now the Shell refinery, I guess it was Shell when I was here, they had fires on Grassy Lake in the 19 teens and 20s. And there was a lawsuit the railroads sued the oil companies to try to get them to stop dumping water or oil in the lake, which as their trains went over the trestle, it would set off fires on the lake and damage their bridges. So they were not very happy about that. And the court records documented a 4 or 5 inch layer of tarry sludge on the base of the lake. While we were there, while I was in Illinois at least, some conservation group, it might have been the Nature Conservancy, I don't recall, was talking about acquiring what was left of this lake as a wildlife sanctuary or refuge or some protected area. And we discouraged them, saying you might want to be concerned about potential Superfund liability and maybe leave it with Shell for the time being. We also looked very carefully at the community of what's now Sauget. Originally it was named Monsanto. Monsanto decided they didn't want the town name Monsanto anymore because there'd be headlines in the St. Louis paper, Monsanto man robs bank. You know, the implication was that it was one of their employees and not just a resident of Monsanto, so they had the name changed to Sauget. But that's a little digression. But this is a site where they have a major chemical processing plant, and as we were doing investigations of what transpired there, the Geological Survey had these wonderful engineering drawings from Monsanto that showed both their old and their new toxic dump. Not the kind of documentation you find, but I tell you, we were really thrilled to see this level of detail. But this is almost immediately adjacent to what's known as Dead Creek, which was the slough shown on the left is Dead Creek. In the center is a picture I took when I was here in the 80s, and the other picture is an aerial photograph which shows the area running right adjacent to a trailer park in a residential area. So we were able to provide some documentation of the industrial waste-related activity immediately adjacent to that site. From those series of case studies, we moved to doing broader models. This is a descriptive model, not a numerical sort of modeling process, but we looked at where industry operated in cities, where industry stopped operating in cities, where they dumped waste in the past, and you can see a gradual change over time from what we call the pedestrian city. The early industrial city had industry clustered at the center. Most of the waste went right on the ground or right in the most immediate waterways when there was really virtually no regulation. In the 1920s, we begin to see regulation of waste, and particularly the call for treatment of liquid waste, and the recognition that waste could be toxic and kill biological life. During that same time period, between 1870 and 1930, we begin to see more and more expansion of industries out from the city centers to railroad corridor sites, to far-flung districts like the Lake Calumet area, and we see new areas of accumulation of waste, both hazardous and non-hazardous, both special and unspecial. And then by the 1980s, the landscape has changed once again, and we have abandonment of many of the former industrial areas in the city center. We see some dereliction, some abandonment, some obliteration of sites in the railroad corridor, and an emergence of new sites at highway interchanges, but also covering up of waste disposal sites in old quarries and old landfills and old wetland areas that had been used as fill repositories. Love Park in Rockford was one of these areas. It was an old wetland area that was used as fill. We found there's several old limestone quarries and clay pits in the Chicago area that were used as waste dumping areas. So this shows that gradual change, and if you put this all together in one kind of broad portrait, you can see that there's a overall expansion of industrial waste activity, a dispersal of industrial waste disposal activity in urban areas, which made the job even tougher in the 1980s to find all those sites and document where they were. But at least RCRA was beginning to keep an account of those kinds of things. This work led to collaboration with an engineer from the state of Illinois who'd done all the engineering work for the Love Canal case, and we got involved with the punitive damages suit against Hooker Chemical. And Pete Skinner and I prepared a book that looked at the long-term relationship of industry and environment. We looked at the state of knowledge about what was toxic and what was not, how wastes were managed, what was the technology for managing waste, and what was the regulatory framework. We put this together in a rather sweeping portrait from the late 19th century to about 1970. We also developed a series of tools. We had a historical hazardous substance database that matched standard industrial classification codes with the type of hazardous materials they worked with. We scoured through all the old SACS dangerous materials manuals, the occupational health literature, and created this handy little database on a floppy disk that could buy. Apparently, the museum still gets calls for these, and I got a call a few weeks ago myself for one. We then matched that information with information from the San Juan Fire Insurance Maps to create a historical hazards GIS system. We mapped some 35,000 plus sites for Illinois and identified them by their industrial classification code for multiple periods of time and matched that with the database. And with that, we could then do reports for real estate transactions. People wanted environmental site assessments. They needed to know what had happened at the property they were acquiring and what had happened around it. And people could give us coordinates. We'd print out these maps that show the sites. We'd number them, and then you could print out a database, print out the contents of the database that showed the kind of industry and the kind of materials that would have been handled. This didn't document the waste was there, but showed the kind of activity that had occurred. We also got involved with litigation support work, doing potentially responsible party searches, investigating who held the property, what they'd done in the past. And one of the first cases we did on that was the Richmond Harbor situation, a Liberty shipbuilding facility in the northern end of San Francisco Bay during World War II. Tons of lead contamination at the site. Lead paint was used widely, and it was redeveloped into a condominium marina area in the early 2000s, and there was a giant suit between the various responsible parties. We documented as best we could the historical activity at that site. Many potential responsible parties sued the government. If they had been involved as an owner-operator site, the Tucson Airport Authority, the government managed certain activities like storage of aircraft, and the Tucson Airport Authority was trying to get the government in as a responsible party. There was a whole spate of these kind of things. We also did a lot of work on insurance, general liability insurance claims, where manufacturers were suing their insurance companies under general liability policies, saying that they could not expect or intend to cause off-site damage by the release of hazardous materials, and that proved to be a hard case to make in many cases because the industry had some pretty phenomenal records showing that they did know all about groundwater movement and fate and transport of toxic waste. Not like we know today, but they had the general picture pretty clearly in mind. We began moving into the sustainability arena with looking at brownfields in the 1990s and environmental justice areas, because sustainability is not just about the management of resources, but about keeping society sustainable. And Bill Clinton's 1994 executive order calling for all federal activities to include an environmental justice examination to see if there would be undue burdens placed on minority and low-income populations. So we began doing a little work in that area before I departed. But overall, in the context created by Superfund and in the evolving array of concerns that followed its passage, the Hazardous Waste Center was really a pioneer in terms of developing research methods on historical hazardous waste, developing tools to support both real estate transaction and Superfund litigation, and really join the leadership of sustainability in looking at brownfields and environmental justice in Illinois. And again, I want to thank the Center for giving me an opportunity to really start my career here, and it was a real pleasure being part of this organization. Thank you.